when Senator John Kennedy pulled out a single index card. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez carefully crafted political image didn't just crack, it shattered in real time. The House Ethics Panel didn't murmur, hesitate, or conceal itself behind political smoke. They released a joint 26-page decision stating Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez received forbidden presents linked to the 2021 Met Gala, where she paraded tax the rich inside a venue, costing far beyond the means of almost any laborer she purported to fight for. 4 Republicans, alongside 4 Democrats, came to the exact same verdict, meaning the standard evasion tactics were shut down before Senator John Kennedy even picked up his disposable coffee cup. Because this wasn't some television news rumor or a campaign attack, Ocasio-Cortez attempted to frame the inquiry as an archaic fixation on a garment, arguing that healthcare, housing, and the climate warranted the panel's focus. However, Kennedy rejected the distraction and pivoted back to the official judgment from her own governing body. He opened a single piece of paper, recited the date, stated the conclusion, and peeled away every ornamental excuse she had built around the scandal, exposing a reality that no volume of progressive rhetoric could blur. The garment was crimson, the painted phrase was bold, the press was everywhere, yet the verdict remained black and white. And that stark contrast was exactly where Kennedy planned to trap her. He then detailed what the panel confirmed: she acquired the bespoke designer gown, a handbag, footwear, expensive jewelry, professional hairstyling, makeup application, exclusive transport, a secluded preparation space, and gala entry for her partner, all tied to an event where one pass could run $35,000. Ocasio-Cortez insisted that she had attempted to cover the costs and subsequently paid the balances, but Kennedy's counter was that the payments only materialized after watchdogs started asking questions, transforming her narrative of eager compliance into a flimsy excuse. The panel discovered her team had reached out to the creator to negotiate cheaper rates, and when a lawmaker pressures a supplier to slash prices linked to an exclusive political gathering, Kennedy reasoned, the ensuing price cut doesn't magically become standard business just because a receipt is eventually produced. He didn't have to raise his voice or fabricate anything, since the hypocrisy was glaringly obvious. A leader whose entire reputation hinges on attacking elitism had absorbed luxuries everyday citizens could never access, and then spun the belated reimbursement as evidence of purity. That was the initial blow, executed quietly, and it resonated because it made the public weigh her fierce rhetoric regarding systemic power against the VIP treatment she demanded when that power worked for her. Kennedy then focused on Aurora James, the creator of the garment, a black female business owner who had launched her brand, and supplied the piece simply because she supported the statement Ocasio-Cortez wished to broadcast to the masses. The billing timeline was brutal in its simplicity. September came and went without compensation. Then followed October, November, December, and January, and only when the Office of Congressional Ethics inquired with the representative staff in February did the checks finally appear. Ocasio-Cortez labeled it an administrative oversight, but Kennedy wouldn't let sterile office jargon wash away 9 months of waiting, because the individual left unpaid wasn't a massive conglomerate, a financial institution, or a tycoon she regularly demonizes. It was a hard-working woman who crafted the core of Ocasio-Cortez's public spectacle using her own hands, while the lawmaker graced magazine covers, leveraging that uncompensated labor as an emblem of financial equity. Kennedy's argument required no partisan alignment. Where he originated from: when an individual builds something for you, you compensate them, and you don't wait until watchdogs force the transaction into the light. The ultimate agreement mandated extra disbursements approaching $3,000, covering funds for the creator and fees tied to her boyfriend's entry. Kennedy framed this not as a vindication, but as concrete proof that the initial deal was never as pure as Ocasio-Cortez suggested. He pointed out that her political apparatus was fueled by $5 donations from educators, medical aides, hospitality staff, scholars, and drained citizens who sacrificed from tight budgets because they trusted she was fighting for everyday workers just like them. Yet, when an actual laborer stood right before her, supplied hard work, generated worth, and anticipated just compensation, that core principle suddenly became flexible, endlessly postponed, and hidden beneath administrative excuses until the authorities showed up. Ocasio-Cortez continuously stressed that the issue was already fixed, but Kennedy's retort sliced right through her technical deflections. Rectifying a situation only after being exposed does not magically erase the initial behavior that required the fixing in the first place. Issuing a payment exclusively under the pressure of being caught is completely different from operating with integrity from the start. In just this single portion of the inquiry, he stripped away the dazzling lights, the media frenzy, and the cheering crowds from the tax, the rich phrase, revealing exactly what was left when the individual displaying the motto was forced to operate under the very same ethical rules stamped across her apparel. Then Kennedy widened the perspective because the garment wasn't his ultimate target. It was merely the entrance to a larger trend he argued had characterized Ocasio-Cortez's public tenure, a pattern where emotionally charged visuals consistently outpaced factual reality and where theatrical symbolism perpetually overshadowed the truth. He initiated this with the 2018 border imagery, the massively shared pictures of her looking visibly heartbroken next to a metal barricade, an image that cemented her nationwide persona as an uncompromising advocate for the vulnerable. Kennedy leveled the charge that this particular fence actually bordered a vacant parking lot, and that there were no incarcerated minors standing just out of frame, while Ocasio-Cortez countered that her visceral response to the overarching familial separation emergency was authentic, pivoting the debate away from the physical reality of the photograph and toward her internal emotional state. Kennedy didn't dispute the potential authenticity of her feelings. He condemned her tactic of weaponizing those emotions to bypass objective truth, because from his perspective, the viral image extracted its immense influence from a false narrative that the actual physical environment simply did not corroborate. By drawing a firm line separating genuine sentiment from factual accuracy, he successfully transitioned from the unpaid gala attire to a much more expansive history of moments where, according to him, the camera captured one story while the underlying facts told another, and the difference would become more damaging with every example Kennedy placed before the room, because each correction exposed another gap between performance and record. Kennedy proceeded to address Ocasio-Cortez's comparison of border holding centers to detention camps, a rhetorical choice loaded with profound historical gravity that far exceeds the bounds of standard political gravity. Discourse. He somberly reminded the Assembly that the phrase, "never again," is the sacred property of survivors of historical atrocities, of families erased by methodical devastation, and of people who still carry numbers tattooed into their skin. Ocasio-Cortez attempted to validate her analogy by referencing scholars. But Kennedy's argument was not that she lacked the right to criticize government policy. His argument was that she borrowed the language of history's most methodical devastation to intensify a contemporary political message, then refused to retreat when survivors objected. For Kennedy, that was not uncontrolled emotion, but a deliberate choice to use another generation's suffering, because ordinary language would never attract the same cameras. From there, he turned to the 6th of January, 2021, when Ocasio-Cortez told the country she believed she was going to die during the attack on the Capitol complex. The statement spread across television, social media, interviews, and fundraising appeals until it became part of the emotional record of that day. Kennedy emphasized that she had been in the Cannon House office building rather than inside the Capitol, and that her building had not been breached by the rioters. Ocasio-Cortez answered that Cannon was part of the Capitol complex. Police had issued warnings, and fear did not become false simply because the physical danger was elsewhere. Kennedy granted that she may have been frightened, but insisted that fear and factual equivalence were different questions when others had faced attackers only feet away. He did not say she had no right to fear. He said public officials must distinguish personal terror from physical circumstances when the entire country is listening. People inside the Capitol barricaded doors, hid under desks, and heard windows breaking nearby, while Ocasio-Cortez was in another building responding to warnings about a wider threat. Kennedy attacked her refusal to clarify that distinction after the stronger version became politically useful, because the dramatic account traveled farther than any later qualification. Ocasio-Cortez said her experience was real and would not be diminished. But Kennedy returned to the same point. No one questioned what she felt, only what she allowed the public to believe. Each example, he argued, began with a camera-ready emotional claim and ended with a factual correction that arrived too late to matter. Kennedy then brought up the September 2021 vote on funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, where Ocasio-Cortez's supporters expected a clear vote against the measure. When the roll call came, she voted present rather than no, avoiding full support or opposition, while others recorded actual positions. Afterward, she cried on the House floor and apologized to constituents who felt betrayed, turning a procedural retreat into another visible emotional episode. Kennedy asked whether anything in Washington failed to produce tears, but his sarcasm was not merely about a woman showing emotion despite her attempt to frame it that way. He argued that the tears repeatedly appeared when political responsibility arrived, converting scrutiny over a decision into a debate about whether critics were insensitive. Ocasio-Cortez accused Kennedy of using an old political tactic, discrediting a woman by branding her emotional, and argued that female politicians are punished for reactions forgiven in men. Kennedy rejected the framing and answered that he was not calling her emotional, but inaccurate, a more damaging distinction because it returned the argument to evidence. The border photograph, concentration camp comparison, January 6th account, and Iron Dome vote followed the same structure: a dramatic image, a moral claim, a massive media response, and a quieter factual problem. He told her the emotion might be sincere, but sincerity did not repair an incorrect statement, excuse an inflated comparison, or replace the duty to correct the record. Reporters stopped typing because Kennedy had reduced years of controversy into one accusation simple enough to remember and difficult to dismiss. Then, Kennedy moved from language to consequences, because words, tears, and symbols could still be defended as interpretation, while 25,000 missing jobs could not. In 2019, Amazon planned to build part of its second headquarters in Long Island City, bringing an estimated 25,000 jobs with an average salary of $150,000. The project was expected to generate roughly $27 billion in New York tax revenue over 25 years, while Amazon would receive about $3 billion in tax incentives. Ocasio-Cortez helped lead the campaign against the arrangement, presented the incentives as a corporate giveaway, and celebrated when Amazon abandoned the New York plan. The headquarters moved to Virginia, taking salaries, construction support work, business activity, and long-term revenue that might have transformed thousands of households. Kennedy asked what Ocasio-Cortez delivered in place of those jobs, because opposition can be dressed as courage until somebody demands the replacement. She repeated that the $3 billion should have supported schools, infrastructure, and neighborhood needs rather than a trillion-dollar corporation. But Kennedy exposed the weakness in that argument. The $3 billion was not cash removed from a school budget and handed to Amazon. It was a reduction in future taxes tied to a project expected to generate far more revenue. By treating the incentive as money already sitting in a public account, she could claim she saved billions even though the larger tax stream vanished when the company left. Kennedy reduced the arithmetic to its brutal core. She did not preserve $3 billion. She helped lose $27 billion. He then asked how much replacement investment reached the district after Amazon withdrew, and Ocasio-Cortez answered that economic development was complicated and required time. Kennedy demanded a number rather than a theory, because years of speeches had not produced a comparable project. comparable revenue, or comparable employment? His answer was 0. The most unforgiving number available to a politician who had declared victory, while the promised alternative never arrived. No 25,000 jobs, no $150,000 average salaries, no new headquarters, no equivalent tax stream, and no community investment large enough to replace what was rejected. The celebration remained online, but the opportunity crossed the state line and settled in Virginia, where families received the paychecks. Queens had been told it was better off without. Ocasio-Cortez defended her opposition by accusing Amazon of exploiting workers, resisting unions, underpaying warehouse employees, and using corporate power to reshape neighborhoods for the benefit of people who already had money. She argued that bringing the company into Queens would have accelerated gentrification, raised rents, pushed out longtime residents, and handed a trillion-dollar corporation public favors, while working families absorbed the damage. Kennedy did not deny that Amazon deserved scrutiny, but he refused to let a familiar list of corporate criticisms erase the specific project she had helped destroy. He pointed out that these were not warehouse positions paying poverty wages, but professional and support jobs attached to an average salary of $150,000, a level of income that could change the trajectory of an entire household. In his framing, Ocasio-Cortez had taken legitimate concerns about corporate conduct and used them as a blanket excuse for driving away an opportunity her district never managed to replace. The argument became more personal when Ocasio-Cortez accused Kennedy of being a millionaire from Louisiana who could not understand the pressures facing families in the Bronx and Queens. She said he had never represented a district like hers, never watched gentrification hollow out a neighborhood, and never experienced the fear of seeing a community sold to whoever could pay the highest price. Then she attacked the image he carried into the room, mocking the folksy accent, the styrofoam cup, and the manner that made him appear simpler than the politicians surrounding him. It was the kind of dismissal Washington specializes in, reducing a man's intelligence to the sound of his voice and assuming that regional speech must be evidence of regional ignorance. Ocasio-Cortez intended to strip Kennedy of authority, but instead, she gave him the cleanest opening of the entire hearing. Kennedy's expression barely changed, yet the drawl disappeared long enough for the room to understand exactly how badly she had misjudged him. He stated that he had graduated with honors from Vanderbilt University, earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, completed advanced legal study at Oxford, and spent 4 decades in public service. Then he delivered the correction without theatrical anger, telling her not to confuse the way he spoke with the way he thought. The sentence landed because it exposed the arrogance behind her attack, an arrogance that claimed to defend ordinary Americans while treating a Southern accent as proof that the speaker could not possibly understand policy. For several seconds, Kennedy stopped being the harmless older man she had assumed she could belittle and became the disciplined lawyer who had allowed her to underestimate him. The drawl returned, but the atmosphere did not, because everyone in the room had now seen the precision sitting underneath the relaxed manner. Kennedy brought the discussion back to the 25,000 families who never received the jobs Ocasio-Cortez had celebrated chasing away. He named the workers who would have depended on the project beyond its executives, including receptionists, security personnel, cafeteria employees, technicians, maintenance crews, drivers, and contractors whose children attended the same public schools she invoked in every speech. These were not abstract symbols in an economic theory, but people who would have received paychecks, benefits, promotions, and stability from an employer she had successfully driven across state lines. Ocasio-Cortez had described Amazon's departure as a victory, while Kennedy described it as a loss, borne by people who never had the luxury of turning down $150,000. He then repeated the lesson attributed to his grandmother that a person reveals something essential through the things that person chooses to celebrate. Some people celebrate when neighbors get raises, when parents gain stability, and when children inherit opportunities their families never had before. Others celebrate when investment leaves, when jobs disappear, and when political symbolism defeats the practical interest of the people whose names appear in campaign speeches. Kennedy did not need to accuse Ocasio-Cortez of hating her district because his charge was more precise and therefore more damaging. She had celebrated a political win while her district absorbed the economic defeat. That distinction left her with nowhere comfortable to stand, because every defense required her to explain why the families she represented were better off with nothing. A Democratic member quietly observed that economic opportunity in underserved communities should not be treated as a partisan issue, and the statement mattered because it did not come from Kennedy's side of the room. No one openly condemned Ocasio-Cortez, but no one rushed to rescue her either. And that silence revealed how quickly political support can thin when the numbers become impossible to spin. Her chief of staff began texting rapidly, searching for a response that could redirect the hearing toward ideology, identity, or party loyalty. But the economic record refused to cooperate. The woman who had spent years accusing corporations of harming workers was now being forced to defend a campaign that had helped remove thousands of high-paying jobs from the very district she claimed to protect. Kennedy had turned her strongest political language against her, not by changing the subject, but by asking whether her own decisions had delivered the results her language promised. Then Kennedy reached into his jacket and removed the 3x5 index card that had remained hidden throughout the hearing. Ocasio-Cortez immediately asked the chairman for a 5-minute recess, a request that exposed her urgency because Kennedy had already questioned her for more than an hour without touching the object he had carried from the beginning. The chairman refused to stop the proceeding and allowed Kennedy to continue, while the room leaned forward because everyone understood that the card was not another timeline or quotation. Kennedy put on his glasses slowly, placed the card face down, and began reading figures from Ocasio-Cortez's 2025 campaign filings without relying on a binder or staff briefing. The performance was restrained, but the message was obvious. He had memorized the numbers because he expected them to become the final measure of everything she had claimed to represent. He began with more than $53,000 in campaign-funded hotel spending, connected to stays in San Juan, Puerto Rico, including a venue where Ocasio-Cortez had been photographed attending a Bad Bunny concert. She characterized the travel as campaign-related, but Kennedy asked the obvious question of whether the performer had been campaigning for her, a question she did not answer. He then moved to a New York sushi restaurant offering a 1-4 course tasting menu priced around $150 per person, another expense paid from campaign funds. Ocasio-Cortez defended campaign dinners as standard practice in both parties, but that response only made the contradiction uglier because she had never built her brand around behaving like both parties. She built it around being different, being accountable, and refusing the indulgences of the political class. Yet her donors were now financing meals many of them could not afford for themselves. Kennedy then identified 3 payments made during 2025 to Dr. Brian Bowl totaling $18,725, described in the filings as leadership training and consulting. He noted that Bowl was a psychiatrist and a chief psychiatric officer associated with a clinic specializing in specialized clinical therapy. While his public profiles did not advertise leadership training for political campaigns, Ocasio-Cortez responded that the services involved executive coaching and organizational consulting, insisting that every dollar had been properly disclosed under federal regulations. Kennedy answered that the description still created a problem. If the services were psychiatric, they could be personal expenses, while if they were leadership training, the provider's own advertised services did not appear to match the filing. Either the description was inaccurate or the nature of the services was being concealed, and both possibilities destroyed the clean compliance claim she had offered seconds earlier. Kennedy said he had contacted the clinic and had been told it did not offer leadership training or political consulting, closing the final escape route before Ocasio-Cortez could construct it. He reminded her that personal expenses cannot legally be paid with campaign funds, and that accurate disclosure requires the stated purpose to match the service actually provided. She did not answer because any explanation risked turning the filing into a false description or the payment into an improper personal benefit. Kennedy then turned the index card over, revealing two numbers written in blue ink, plain enough to be understood by every camera, and devastating enough to end the argument without another folder. One number represented what he said she had spent from campaign funds on herself, and the other represented what the average household in her district earned in an entire year. But Kennedy had not yet spoken the sentence that would bind those figures together. Kennedy held the cards steady and identified the first figure as $77,000 in campaign-funded expenses connected to hotels, restaurants, professional services, makeup, and other costs centered on Ocasio-Cortez herself. Then he pointed to the second figure, $37,000, the median household income in New York's 14th Congressional District, covering families across the Bronx and Queens who worked full-time and still struggled to remain financially stable. The comparison was not complicated, ideological, or buried inside committee language, because one number represented what her political operations spent on her in a year, while the other represented what many of her constituents earned during that same year. Kennedy had reduced the entire hearing to arithmetic that required no expert, no partisan interpreter, and no television panel to explain what voters were seeing. She had spent more donor money on herself than the average household she represented brought home after 12 months of labor. Those donors were teachers, home health aides, bodega owners, students, nurses, service workers, and exhausted parents who gave $5 because they believed her promise that politics could be cleaner, fairer, and less corrupt. Many of them donated from paychecks already consumed by rent, groceries, transportation, medical bills, and rising prices, yet their money had traveled into luxury hotels, expensive meals, and services they would never purchase for themselves. Kennedy did not accuse them of being foolish because his anger was directed at the politician who had turned their trust into a personal spending account while continuing to lecture everyone else about economic inequality. He reminded the room that these people were not wealthy lobbyists buying access, but ordinary supporters making small sacrifices because Ocasio-Cortez had persuaded them that she lived under the same rules they did. Then he delivered the 6 words that ended every available defense. "Ma'am, your voters cannot afford you." The sentence cracked through the room because it converted campaign finance into personal betrayal, forcing every previous argument back onto the people whose $5 donations made the spending possible. Ocasio-Cortez looked at the card, looked at Kennedy, and returned to the card, because neither ideology nor identity could change the relationship between 77,000 and 37,000. She began to answer, accused him of being deliberate, and then stopped when her voice failed, before the sentence could become a complete defense. She pushed the microphone away, creating a sharp scrape against the desk that sounded louder than any speech, because it was the first unmistakable sign that she wanted the questioning physically removed from her. For the first time during the hearing, the politician famous for instant responses, viral clips, and aggressive counterattacks could not produce a usable line. Her chief of staff stopped texting and stared at the back of her head, waiting for a policy pivot, procedural objection, personal accusation, or emotional appeal that never arrived. The silence stretched beyond ordinary discomfort. While reporters stopped typing, aides froze over their notes, and the ventilation system filled the space where Ocasio-Cortez's answer should have been. She reached for water, took a controlled sip, and placed the glass down, but even that small movement only emphasized that she was buying seconds without finding words. Every response available to her carried its own danger, because an explanation could sound like an admission, a justification could sound like entitlement, and outrage could confirm that Kennedy had touched the one subject she could not dominate. Silence was the least damaging option. Yet, in that room, silence sounded exactly like a verdict. Kennedy did not celebrate, raise his voice, or repeat the line for the cameras, because repeating it would have weakened a conclusion already sitting between them in blue ink. He picked up the styrofoam cup, took one final sip, and placed it beside the index card, leaving the cheapest object in the room next to the most damaging evidence presented all day. The contrast captured the entire hearing. A man who appeared to arrive with almost nothing, using two ordinary objects to dismantle a political image built through expensive events, national media, and carefully managed symbolism. He said he had no further questions, allowing the final words to remain untouched rather than burying them beneath another accusation. The hearing ended not with a dramatic explosion, but with Ocasio-Cortez unable to move past two numbers her own political message had made impossible to defend. She left through a side corridor without holding a press conference, recording an Instagram response, or stopping to confront the reporters waiting for a statement. Her communications director was already on the phone, while her chief of staff followed several steps behind, typing rapidly as the political operation began searching for language capable of containing the damage. No one stopped to speak, because every unscripted answer risked feeding the clip that was already spreading across social media and television. Within 48 hours, the footage of Kennedy saying her voters could not afford her had accumulated tens of millions of views, and the image of the index card appeared across cable networks. What began as a campaign finance comparison became a symbol simple enough to print, repost, repeat, and understand without watching the full hearing. People placed the numbers on shirts, signs, and social posts, while someone taped a copy inside the window of a Hunts Point bodega with a handwritten message comparing her hotel spending to local annual income. The reaction mattered because it was no longer limited to Republican commentators, Washington insiders, or voters who had always disliked her. The comparison reached people inside her district who understood immediately what $37,000 meant because they were surviving on something close to it. For them, $77,000 was not an abstract violation buried in a filing, but more than many families earned while working every week of the year. Kennedy had converted a technical campaign finance dispute into a household calculation, and household calculations are harder to dismiss than political accusations. The Federal Election Commission expanded its review of Ocasio-Cortez 2025 disbursements, while questions surrounding the payments to Dr. Brian Bowl remained unresolved inside the Scripps account. Her office had still not publicly reconciled why a psychiatrist associated with specialized clinical treatment appeared in filings under leadership training and consulting. The central issue remained exactly as Kennedy described it. If the services were personal, campaign funds could not properly cover them, and if they were political consulting, the public description of the provider's services did not appear to match. Her office had not been required to explain the discrepancy under oath, leaving the same two doors closed and the same unanswered question hanging over the payments. The hearing had ended, but the filing problem had not disappeared. With the microphone she pushed away. Inside the district, a community organizer from Parkchester, who had previously knocked doors for Ocasio-Cortez, announced a primary challenge built around the same economic contrast Kennedy had exposed. She had never held public office, rode the number 6 train to work, earned $41,000 annually, and launched her campaign by saying she could not afford a $150 dinner. The message was effective because it did not require voters to understand federal regulations, committee procedure, or campaign accounting. It asked whether a representative funded by working people should live through campaign expenses those same working people could never justify in their own lives. Democratic leadership did not rush forward with a passionate defense, offering only the careful reminder that every member remained accountable to the voters. Somewhere in the Bronx, a 22-year-old nursing student who had donated $5 during the previous campaign watched the clip during her lunch break. She saw Kennedy lift the card, listened to the two figures, calculated the difference, and requested a refund because the numbers made the spending feel personal in a way no committee report could. That single refund carried more moral weight than 1,000 television arguments, because it represented trust being withdrawn by the exact kind of supporter Ocasio-Cortez claimed to empower. The voter did not need to become a Republican, abandon progressive policies, or agree with everything Kennedy believed in order to recognize that something about the arrangement was wrong. She only needed to understand that her $5 had gone upward toward a political class that had promised to stand beside her. Kennedy gave no cable interview, released no triumphant statement, and did not linger in the hallway searching for another camera after the hearing ended. He walked out, dropped the styrofoam cup into a trash can near the elevator, took the stairs, and left the 3x5 card on the mahogany desk. A member of the custodial staff found it later while cleaning the room, read the two numbers, and understood the comparison immediately because she earned $34,000 a year. She placed the card in her pocket and carried it home, turning Kennedy's final exhibit into something more powerful than a partisan prop. The card left Washington not with a senator, strategist, or television host, but with a worker whose annual income proved exactly why those two numbers had ended the hearing pain.